Ed Ettinghausen, 3 lessons from my mama bear. 3 lessons from my mama bear, Ed Ettinghausen.
Thank you, Tom. As I was listening to Greg and Horace talk about their mother, I felt a connection with Greg because I am adopted and actually was born in Sacramento. So as you talked about that area, it brought back some memories. And I thought about Horace saying, you're not able to choose your parents. Well, actually, I chose my adopted family. And let me explain how that happened. My mother was kind of a sickly child. And when she was in the 8th grade, she dropped out of school. She was married off to who would become my father when she was 18 and he was 36. He actually had a daughter that was only 4 years older than my mother. So she got pregnant right away and had 4 kids of her own that she raised. And then when my father retired, they decided to take in foster children. And I happened to be the second child that they took in. And it's actually the only family that I know, or only parents I know, because I had been in multiple foster homes from the age of 7 months on. I don't have memories from those, which is probably just as well, since the records show that I had been physically abused in some of those homes. So it's good that I don't have those memories. But my mother and my foster father were attempting to adopt me, and my biological parents wouldn't give permission. My biological mother was schizophrenic bipolar, and she had this idea that at some point she was going to make a home that I could come back to. And that just wasn't possible with her mental illness. So eventually, at the age of 12, the courts were set up in a way to where a 12-year-old could actually make the decision over their biological parents. And so I had the opportunity to decide. I went before a judge. And in judge's chambers, he asked me if this was what I wanted. And of course it was. And they were kind of in a hurry to get that done because my father had colon cancer and was not doing well. It was going downhill pretty quick. So they rushed the paperwork through, and I was adopted at the age of 12, and my name went from Edwin Marion Richardson Jr. to Edwin William Ettinghausen, William being my adopted father's middle name. Got rid of that Marion, which I couldn't stand growing up. I would have gotten rid of Edwin as well, except that my mother convinced me that it was a good name to have. And lest I forget that the second man on the moon was Buzz Aldrin, which his name actually is Edwin, or was Edwin. So she reminded me of that. And after my father died, my mother did become sort of a mother bear. She was the polite way would be to say a burly woman. She was a bit on the large side, so kind of bear-like characteristics, but also very, very protective of me. And I learned some lessons from my mother, many lessons, but 3 of which I'd like to share with you tonight. The first lesson that I can remember from my mother was simply this: mind your manners. I learned from an early age that it wasn't polite to interrupt anyone, especially adults. It also wasn't polite to address an adult by their first name. I learned the manners of addressing them by Mr. or Mrs., but also I learned how to say madam or sir and ma'am, and also yes, please, sorry. All those great words that you learn when you're learning good manners. And I learned also how important it was to have a firm handshake. It's something you would think maybe my father would have taught me, but it was my mother who taught me that. So the first thing that I remember is manners. They were so important, and my mother made sure that I learned those early on. And there was what would now be considered non-traditional punishment that was meted out if I didn't quite mind my manners. It could be something as simple as standing in the corner. And if you remember that as a punishment as a child, standing facing the wall, 6 inches away from the wall in a corner, kind of absurd punishment, but nonetheless, that was our form of timeout back in the 60s. I also sometimes went to bed without dinner. And on some occasions, my mother believed firmly in spare the rod, spoil the child. So I had a few whippings in my time. Those forms of punishment now would maybe be considered abusive, but back in the day, they were par for the course. So manners was the first thing that my mother taught me. The second thing that she taught me, and I don't think she taught this to me by design, but it was mind over matter. My mother had this odd, peculiar way of getting strep throat every February. And as January would roll around, she would talk about it and then remind everyone that she was going to get strep throat in February. And sure enough, every single year in February, my mother got strep throat. Mind over matter. Another mind over matter that I learned from my mother is she had a severe fear of snakes. I remember one time we were driving to church and there was a snake in the road, and my mom said, "George, kill it." And of course, my father swerved the car and ran over the snake. And she said, "George, kill it again." And he backed up and ran over the snake again. As we pulled away on our way to church, I looked behind me, and that poor, lifeless stick was still in the road. And I remember there was a young lady that I had an interest in who had caught a king snake. Wild king snake was quite tame, and I really wanted to impress her, but I had that fear of snakes from my mother. But somehow mind over matter had something that was more important to me than that fear. And I actually held that snake and realized for the very first time, you know what? Snakes aren't so bad after all. The third thing that my mother taught me, and my mother died when I was 18. I was off in college. What I find to be interesting is that she had a severe heart attack and needed CPR, and none of my family knew CPR. At the time, I was taking a CPR instructor course and became actually a full-time CPR instructor. I've done that now for over 30 years. But a lesson I learned from my mom is mind your memories. My mother wasn't a saint by any stretch of the imagination, but she did the best with what she had. And even though it's now been almost 42 years since my mother passed away, we have the opportunity to choose what memories we recall and what memories we foster in our mind and what memories we adopt. And so I've chosen to focus on all the good memories. And I had quite a few with my mother. So I would challenge you as you think back on your mother, if she's no longer with you, to think about the memories that serve you well. For me, again, minding my manners, mind over matter, and mind your memories. And I would just challenge you to keep that in mind. And any of the characteristics of your mother that maybe weren't so admirable, how about just let those go? Because as my friend Randy likes to say, it's all in your head. Back to you, Mr. Toastmaster.